The leaders of Eritrea and Ethiopia are meeting to revive stalled peace negotiations. Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki arrived in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, where he was met by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Now, the two countries signed a historic peace agreement last year, ending a two-decade military standoff. But uncertainty remains around economic cooperation and border crossings. A Ugandan official says 7 Eritrean football players have disappeared at the end of a regional tournament. The players are the latest to defect from Eritrea, which has been described by human rights groups as one of the most tightly controlled regimes in the world.
Fleeing Eritrea, footballers go missing in Uganda in a carbon copy disappearance from earlier tournaments. Fear, human rights abuses and years of military service blamed for the latest defections. But is their action enough to expose Eritrea's restrictive regime? Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, ever since independence from Ethiopia 26 years ago, Eritrea has been ruled by President Afwerki. He dismisses rights groups, alleging his regime is one of the world's most tightly controlled, where opposition parties are banned and the judiciary isn't independent. Thousands of Eritreans leave every year, mainly to escape rights abuses, as well as enforced and lengthy military service. And footballers too, defecting while playing abroad for the second time this year. 7 went missing after their final game at a recent regional tournament in Uganda's capital, Kampala. 5 fled their hotel in Uganda in the middle of a regional tournament in October. In 2015, 10 players refused to return home after a World Cup qualifier in Botswana. 15 players and the team doctor disappeared in Uganda in 2012 and were granted asylum a year later. And in 2009, the entire team failed to return home from a tournament in Kenya. Amnesty International says a turning point for human rights violations in Eritrea was when the government campaign of repression started in 2001. Amnesty says Eritrea is dangerous for anyone showing political dissent or attempting to avoid national service. Government critics in exile say they're often harassed or threatened by the ruling party. Eritreans who stay often face indefinite detention for publicly criticizing the government. Journalists and human rights activists have often disappeared. Eritreans who get caught fleeing the country can be detained indefinitely. Let's bring in our guest to the show. We have Matt Bryden. He's a strategic advisor at Sahan Research, a think tank which focuses on issues in the Horn of Africa. He joins us by Skype from Nairobi in Kenya. Daniel Mekonnen is director of the Eritrean Law Society. He's also a former judge in Eritrea. He joins us from Geneva in Switzerland. Awal Allo is senior lecturer in law at Keele University in England. He joins us by Skype too. Welcome to all of you. Let's start, if we can, with Awal. So why do we keep seeing, in particular, Eritrean sports players disappearing?
Well, I think the background context is the serious and the massive human rights violations in Eritrea. This has been documented by consistent reports, not just by independent human rights organizations, but also governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations. There has been widespread and consistent violations of human rights, extreme political repression, particularly the national service, that also leads to very difficult economic conditions. Those are the kinds of realities that people are trying to avoid, including footballers who, relatively speaking, have a better life in the country.
Which is kind of my point, since they have a relatively better life, why do we keep seeing them going missing? Matt, what's your take on this?
I think it's probably explained in two ways. One is that the numbers we see of footballers are relatively small if you take into account the overall numbers of people who continue to flee Eritrea. The most recent figures I've seen from October this year suggest that as many as 300 refugees cross the border to Ethiopia every day, although those numbers fluctuate month by month. So it's a massive exodus that's been going on for years, and footballers represent just a microcosm. But I also think it's because footballers and other athletes are among the few very privileged groups who are able to travel outside Eritrea, get exit visas and passports, and are free to visit other countries. And of course, many take the opportunity not to return to what could be a life of indefinite national service or other types of repression, as your introduction and the previous guest have described.
Now, let's bring in, if we can, Daniel. How is the human rights situation, the situation with inscription to the military, how has all of that evolved since the peace deal last year, in 2018, last year, with Ethiopia?
Well, as far as the internal political dynamics of Eritrea is concerned, nothing has changed even after the ratification of the new peace and friendship agreement with Ethiopia. Of course, there was a high level of expectation on the part of many Eritreans that the government would change course, that the government would start some sort of political transition by releasing political prisoners, by implementing the 1997 Eritrean constitution, and also by restoring the now defunct transitional parliament of Eritrea, and so forth and so forth. But nothing of this type has taken place thus far since July 2018. It's been exactly 18 months since the ratification of the new peace and friendship agreement. But unfortunately, very sadly, the political situation remains business as usual. And that's why we see these latest developments of footballers escaping in large numbers, like what has been the case before over the last 15 to 20 years. So nothing has changed really, in spite of the high level of expectation on the part of the general population in Eritrea.
Not only are we not seeing people being released, but we saw last year even a former Minister of Finance, arrested. That was after the peace deal with Ethiopia is signed. Is that a sign that perhaps the regime is feeling more vulnerable?
You know, when the peace deal between the two countries was signed, the expectation on the part of the international community, and most people were observing Eritrea for a very long time, was that Eritrea would no longer have the justification for maintaining the kind of very repressive security and political situation that it maintained at home. Because, during the 18 years of stalemate with Ethiopia, most people understood that there is this very huge neighboring country that is an adversary who took Eritrean territory and refused to return Eritrean territory even after an international court decided that the territory belonged to Eritrea. So there was a weight, the weight of international law was with Eritrea, and people to some extent thought that Eritrea has some kind of justification. But when the peace deal was signed between the two countries, most people thought that there would be no more justification for the continuity of national service and for huge political repression at home. As Daniel was saying, that people thought the constitution would be restored and the Eritrean parliament would also be put back on track. But none of that have happened. But clearly, I think the Eritrean government doesn't seem to have any intention of opening the political process up. And the fact that Ethiopia opened itself up, it is a neighbor, the part of Ethiopia that borders Eritrean territory still remained hostile to Eritrea. That made the Eritrean government extremely hostile. And I think that's also what led to the closure of the border, because the refugees that are flowing from Eritrea into Ethiopia were stationed close to the border. And Eritrea sees that refugee camp not just as a space where refugees are hosted, but also as a breeding ground for Eritrean opposition. So those are, I think, among the reasons why the peace deal didn't seem to have moved as much as was expected, and also that I think explains Eritrea's the leadership's vulnerability.
Matt, will it come with time? Is there any indication that the relaxation, shall we say, of the relationship with Ethiopia will lead to a relaxation of some of the tense security measures in place domestically?
Well, I have to agree with Awal that we don't see any sign of that so far. And I would go a step further and would add that in some ways it seems like Eritrea's leadership has been emboldened by the peace deal. Sanctions have been lifted. The isolation under which the Eritrean leadership has lived under so many years has started to thaw. Isaias Afewerki has been trying to rehabilitate his image and to become a statesman or an elder statesman even in the Horn of Africa region, fostering not just a peace deal with Ethiopia, but a three-way alliance with the government in Mogadishu. And yet, as we've heard, nothing has changed back in Eritrea. I believe there was some
Matt, let me jump in there. That's an interesting point. Do you think the international community has willfully turned a blind eye to the repression in Eritrea, lifting sanctions, handing out Nobel Peace Prizes, while people remain locked up in jails for, in some cases, decades?
I think that's very much the case, and much of the commentary surrounding the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia was that the prize should be seen as a sign of encouragement and aspiration, not a recognition of achievements that had been realized on the ground. And I think there were reasons as well that President Isaias didn't share in that Nobel Prize, because he certainly wasn't the one who took the initiative to lead the peace deal. But the international community seems to be looking for a good news story. The fact that Eritrea still has a border dispute with Djibouti, which was one of the reasons for sanctions, is still failing to provide any information on Djiboutian soldiers who are missing in action or possibly prisoners of war, another justification for sanctions. All of that has been set aside in the hopes that somehow some positive momentum can be built behind these developments. But I don't see any sign of real change in the near future.
Well, let me go back to Awal. Why are we seeing the international community turning that blind eye, Awal?
I don't think the international community is turning a blind eye towards Eritrea in particular. I think the international community, if there is such a thing, usually intervenes whenever the interests of powerful countries aligns with the interests of people, which is usually very rare. But I don't think particularly the international community is turning a blind eye. Over the course of the last 18 years, I think Ethiopia pressured the international community in a lot of different ways to isolate the Eritrean government. The isolation of the Eritrean government also, in my understanding, brought a lot of misery to the Eritrean people. Economically, the country was excluded. In the final analysis, it's ordinary people who actually paid the price for the economic burden the country was under. I think, the world tried to
do we know
isolate
how many
Eritrea.
people have been forcibly disappeared?
And I don't have the exact figure, but a significant number of people. In terms of the human rights situation in Eritrea, as I said, the regime is extremely repressive. There has been consistent reports of gross violations of human rights put out by credible human rights organizations. There is no doubt on that. But I think in terms of how we should move forward, the question of whether isolating Eritrea would work, I think in my view, the world tried isolating Eritrea for a very long time. Maybe it is time to try a little bit of both now, bringing Eritrea in from the cold, but engaging with the regime, allowing Eritreans themselves to bring pressure to be on the Eritrean government.
Daniel, you were a judge. Tell us how the judiciary operates in this state of repression.
Well, it's been many years since I left the country, but at some point I can tell you that there was a certain degree of independence the judiciary enjoyed, even in trying to protect fundamental rights and freedoms. I'm now talking in terms of the pre-2001 political crisis. So everything changed after 2001 when the Eritrean government shut down the private newspapers of the day, and when it decided to imprison the so-called Group of 15 or the G15, who were high-ranking Eritrean government officials of the day who initiated a reform movement criticizing the president of the country. So everything has changed since then. But even when I say there was a certain degree of independence enjoyed by the judicial branch, it doesn't mean that the judiciary was indeed truly free and independent in the real sense of the term, as we see in other experiences. But definitely in relative terms, I can say there was some space. So things have changed completely since 2001, and what we see now is a complete breakdown of the rule of law, as has been sufficiently reported now by the two major reports of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights Violations in Eritrea, and of course the follow-up reports as well by the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, including the report of the Special Rapporteur from last year, from June 2018. Perhaps I can also clarify one of the questions you asked previously as to how many people have been victimized by the government's widespread practice of human rights violations, in particular the crime of enforced disappearance. And I can tell you the numbers are estimated in tens of thousands. There are credible reports previously published by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other rights groups. And even according to my own research findings since 2001, including to previous reports that were published by the Office of the Attorney General in Eritrea, the numbers of people who have been victimized by the specific crime of enforced disappearance is estimated way beyond 10,000. So these numbers are very high for a small country like Eritrea, which has a population of plus minus 5 million people. So it's a very, very problematic situation.
Right.
And this needs to come to an end. And that's the fundamental question we need to address.
Well, we perhaps should point out that this show did extend an invitation to Eritrean authorities for them to send someone to join us for their perspective on this. Unfortunately, we didn't get someone's participation from officials. Let me present perhaps the other side of the argument in terms of the government's achievements. And Matt, the government would probably argue, well, it's made quite significant developmental progress, reducing mortality rates, improving food security, agricultural production, improvements in infrastructure development, and so on and so forth. Is life economically getting better for Eritreans, even if politically it's looking bleak?
Well, I haven't been able to visit the country for several years, so I couldn't tell you firsthand. But I think the government can't have it both ways. On the one hand, it makes a great deal of propaganda and media mileage out of developmental projects which receive a lot of attention. Whether or not they actually contribute to the overall betterment of the Eritrean people, I think is questionable. In terms of the Eritrean economy's growth or improvement, as far as I'm aware, we've seen no signs of that. At the same time that the government has been proclaiming these advances, it has been decrying the devastating effect of sanctions on the people of Eritrea. And I think it's really important to understand that the sanctions regime on Eritrea had only two parts. One was an arms embargo, which prevented the country from importing or exporting weapons. And the other was a prohibition on Eritrean support to foreign armed groups around the Horn of Africa region. So there were no economic sanctions on Eritrea. There was a symbolic isolation of the country because the UN imposed this sanctions regime. But no Eritrean official or institution was ever subjected to assets freeze, travel ban, or the other measures that the UN could have imposed. So I think it's been a really a self-serving narrative that the Eritrean leadership has used to justify tremendous economic and political mismanagement at home. I know from my own work on Eritrea, the Eritrean commercial bank and central bank for many years had no foreign exchange reserves. These were held in banks that belonged to the ruling party. They were held in correspondent banks abroad. But basically what you had is a situation where the ruling party has superseded the institutions of government and is effectively run by a handful of people. And as long as these conditions persist, I really don't see any hope for major development or economic progress on the part of Eritrea as a country.
Arwal, Eritrea is one of the world's largest producers of refugees when you take the numbers as a percentage of the total population. Many of those people are the youth. So what sort of toll does that take on the country's economics, its future? The very brains of the country are draining away, some would say.
Absolutely. A significant number of highly educated Eritreans leave the country. And Eritreans naturally are very creative, very industrious people. So when you lose some of the best and the brightest to foreign competitors, in this case, it's not even people necessarily leaving for economic purposes, people who are also fleeing political repression. That certainly, I think, puts the Eritrean economy at a significant disadvantage. And also some of it is public services. You will not be able to, for example, provide education and health without capable people. So that would be, I think, a significant drain on the economic and social sectors in the country. But I think going back to the issue raised by your guest in Nairobi, while sanctions in the past have worked in certain contexts, sanctions usually don't work. Even those that are referred to as smart sanctions, that are very specifically targeted at specific institutions, usually don't work. It's ultimately the general public that pays the price. So there are, I think, a number of areas that can be explored in terms of engaging the Eritrean government, improving the living conditions in Eritrea, but calling for sanctions, while it can bring pressure on the Eritrean government, but the Eritrean government, I think the government as a government can survive. And it also, in most cases, functions to divide people because this is a highly nationalist country. So I think it is important to try and understand the political dynamics internally, but also the social and political structure, not just in that country, but broadly in the region as well.
Perhaps it's important also to keep in mind we're able to have a discussion like this, but our guests are all outside of Eritrea. Daniel, just give us an idea of what sort of reach the state has on critics outside of the country, and what sort of harassment people, perhaps even like yourself, may face for speaking out against the Eritrean regime.
Historically, the Eritrean government comes from, the legacy of a liberation movement, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which has had widespread support throughout the Eritrean diaspora communities. And as we all know, Eritrea as a country also has a long history of forced migration, at least dating back to the 1960s, because of the prolonged armed conflict against Ethiopia, basically the War of Liberation, and also after the independence of the country, in particular since 1998, the problem of forced migration has continued persistently. And all because of all these factors, there is a very large contingent of Eritrean diaspora communities throughout the world. And the Eritrean government has effectively controlled the activities, the way of mobilization and organization of these diaspora communities, including by infiltrating through the activities of these communities via its diplomatic channels and circles. And it has a very strong presence throughout the Eritrean diaspora communities. And this includes, unfortunately, as has been recently reported by Amnesty International in June 2019, the practice includes harassment, persecution of activists based in exile. Yes, and it's happening as we speak now. It has happened for many years. And
those who are abroad
and of course, this is also one of the fundamental problems that need to be addressed in all legal ways.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests very much for coming to the show, Matt and Daniel. And thank you for watching too.